Hey, hello everyone. My name is Kyla Jefferson. Today I'm going to be discussing My Mother's Garden by Greenidge and how it links literature to public housing in a social justice aspect. So, if my slide will go. First, I would like to provide a summary of what exactly is Mother's Garden. So, Mother's Garden was published in 2016 by the New York Times. It was an opinion piece that Greenidge wrote, um, where it explored her time at kind of described as a luxury prep school, as a scholarship student, and her mother, who had a tiny garden in public housing, and that her mother was getting her graduate school degree during nighttime through night classes. And this narrative promotes assumptions that are made about public housing and basically is how I chose to explore it in a social justice aspect. So, in this presentation, I will be going ahead and going over these main four topics. However, I will get more detailed per topic. So the first topic will be what is a housing project, so you have an idea of what type of housing that the narrator had. Then I will be going to the art of malicious compliance, stereotyping tenants, and literary representation. So first is the question of what exactly is a housing project? So, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it is a housing development or scheme, typically a government subsidized one with relatively low rents. So, this gives a better understanding of where the narrator was living at the time. And this is the type of public housing that she was living at in this point. At this point, it introduces the assumptions that are brought about in my argument regarding her first person accounts. For basically, the prep school has people that are like children of senators, children of higher bracket people, versus being considered, oh, that's the scholarship kid, which is scholarship student as well, that she uh refers to herself as, and also refers to herself as welfare, basically being on government assistance and public housing. Basically has a tendency, in my paper I'm exploring how there's like a sort of malicious compliance that is necessary if you ever wanted to get out of the projects because of the restrictive rules that they've set. So this brings me to the next point, which is the art of malicious compliance. So I went ahead and added two quotes from the opinion piece. So the first one is, there were other strange rules too. My father unexpectedly sent a desktop computer instead of back payments for child support. So whenever you are living in these public housing, you have to be within a certain bracket. If you exceed it, then you no longer qualify. So basically, you could be making enough that you don't qualify for the public housing, but you're not having enough to live. So there is this idea of malicious compliance that is used. So in this sense that even though the computer could not be used for automatically getting money, and the mother did run the numbers according to the narrator, and she just decided that they will keep the personal computer because in the public housing, they weren't allowed to actually use a personal computer because it would use too much electricity. However, while the mother is looking on getting a way out through higher education and going ahead and trying to get a better job to help her child out, that also means that they had sort of a source of income that they could go ahead and sell later. However, not selling it did allow them to maintain being in the public housing. Which brings me to another quote of hers. Speaking of her being in graduate school, they said, but as she told me, the housing project administrators argued that her scholarships to graduate school should count as her income, and that even though she was also working, being a full-time student meant she could not live in public housing. So, whenever it came to the financial aspect, that is a big part of being able to be a part of public housing. So, whenever, excuse me, whenever she's going to graduate school, she can't say, oh, her scholarships are included in her income because the scholarships were only covering classes. There was nothing left over. It was just enough for covering classes. And the thing is that if it was included in her income, that would put her at risk of being put out of her housing. However, she became a full-time student and it was proof that she could not, then she could not live in public housing, as it appears that there were rules against that that were implied through this opinion piece. So maintaining items that could be used for later, whenever as people like are trying to better their life, is the sense for the personal computer. However, when the mother experienced when they attempt to use her financial aid and like put her over the threshold, shows how it's the public housing system is kind of restrictive whenever it comes to what you can and cannot do according to housing administrators. Which brings me to another point that can occur actually, not only within the opinion piece, but also when thinking about it on a grander scale, which is stereotyping tenants. So, in My Mother's Garden, she said, I was acutely aware that on the surface I could potentially fit all the stereotypes of the welfare queen. I was Black, the daughter of a single mother, and on welfare and food stamps and living in the projects. So this idea basically stems from a premise that when it comes to stereotyping for public housing, it becomes a more difficult process. And the reason why it's more difficult is because she was at this time in the book, she's considered, I'm sorry, not the book, but the opinion piece. She is considered the scholarship student. She references her personality as the scholarship student. Because there's not any sense of like, oh, she is accomplished in ABC. It's just a matter of, oh, she's a scholarship student. She lives in the projects. She is on government assistance. She happened to get into a school with privileged students with higher tax brackets, but she's on scholarship, so she doesn't have to pay for being here. She has to just like maintain grades. However, the stereotyping that occurs for people in public housing or living in housing projects, which I can account for because I did talk to my dad who did live in the projects, and he had informed me that it's the stereotype of people are just like, oh, it's because of someone's race. It is because that they're trying to take advantage. It's because of all these different reasons, basically saying that you are not a victim, which victim mentality is another aspect, or rather thread, that I am exploring in my piece, because I find it important that the stereotypes make no sense whenever you actually experience it, which one of my other sources that I will be getting to later mentions. So this brings me to my last point, which is literary representation. So, in general, there's this other source that I have that is on Black urbanism in literature. And basically, by discussing the housing projects in an opinion piece with a first person account, it expresses this sort of awareness not an awareness of like, oh, these people need help, but they're on government assistance, but also an awareness of the treatment that they are receiving, that there are certain restrictions that they have to do something. They want to do something and they want to get out, but they're at risk of losing their housing. And a loss of housing can cause difficulty in work and being able to continue school. And it's something that isn't widely talked about. It's like, oh, yeah, they needed help getting housing, but rather they don't want to stay in that situation. So I believe that the literary representation of public housing accounts for this awareness of the less talked about things rather than the overarching problem that was solved. So the last thing that I'd like to talk about before I end this presentation is about my works cited, basically breaking it down. So the first one I have on there is My Mother's Garden, which is the source that I am using, and I was looking on specifically the New York Times version. The housing project for the Oxford English Dictionary is basically because it had the best definition for me. Um, when it comes to Rudd's Crystal, the On Perspective and Value Black Urbanism, Black Interiors, and Public Housing Fiction is what I'm using for my literary representation and the potential effects of spreading awareness through literature rather than just proactive um, actions, because the proactive actions seem meaningless because they're like, oh, in the grand scheme of things, they have somewhere to live. But they're stuck in a state that they've been set in, which brings me to my other two sources, the one by Robert Mark Silverman and by Kim Scoba and Marilyn J. Broom, which are both examining stereotypes. The one I would love to bring your attention to is the one by Kim Scoba and Marilyn J. Broom, which they examined the public housing stereotypes through a service learning project. And it's a service learning project with undergraduates who managed to essentially work with the public housing tenants and learning and kind of breaking down that this mentality, this sort of victim mentality that has been placed on them of like, oh, they just want to stay on government assistance isn't true, because it does evaluate their initial opinions versus after actually doing the service learning that there are instances where they're stuck and there's only certain things that they can do, and they're just worried about being at risk of they no longer have a home, which is something that is important, that having a home is essential for you to be able to do other things like have a job or be able to receive important documentation and everything like that, which is not spoken on often. And I was so glad when I found the service learning project. Lastly, I have this one from Bruce Wallace, which is where's the housing and income outcomes of transitional program to end homelessness, which is honestly just evaluating how it was like a it was an answer that they gave of like, oh, we gave them all this housing, and there's not a lot of options for, okay, now that you have a home, but there's certain restrictions in the home, how do I move on from this without going back to homelessness? Which is another aspect that I have been thinking through, because it's a matter of breaking down that victim mentality and the literary representation that's kind of like a call to action of the threads that have not been spoken about in terms of social justice, in terms of public housing, and these stereotypes and all these different things that they face. And on that note, uh, do you have any questions? Feel free to comment the questions. I will gladly answer any of them. And I appreciate you listening to my presentation. Please let me know if there was anything that you were confused about, anything you want to hear more about. I will gladly answer any questions whatsoever. I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening or night, and I hope to see you another time.